Hello and welcome to my talk for BrewEdCleethorpes. This talk is going to be all about the classics department, so ancient history, Latin, ancient languages, that sort of stuff, and the case for including them in secondary schools. Now, immediately you might be having some sort of mental picture being drawn up in your mind, the idea that perhaps these subjects are elitist or XYZ, other ideas, which are what I'm going to try and address in this talk. So my name is Ben Windsor. I'm the lead teacher of classics at my current school, and I'm also just a teacher of humanities as well. In fact, I'm the only teacher of classics in my school, and we'll perhaps go into a few more details as to the sort of challenges that are involved in that. So, subject to my talk, opening Pandora's box. The fact that a lot of people will already know what I mean by that just kind of shows us how ubiquitous the classics actually are in daily life. To use a more modern adage, you might want to say opening a can of worms. And what we're seeing on the screen here is a number of different artworks from the Renaissance era upwards that have been inspired by the story of Pandora, Pandora's box, and might also bring to mind a whole plethora of other pieces of artwork that have been inspired by the classics since their conception. The reason why I've chosen Pandora and Pandora's box as the theme for this talk is, first of all, because I'm a classics teacher, what I'm going to say in my experience of the world is firmly grounded in what I know, which is the classics. Secondly, I do think it's quite a handy visual metaphor. So if we're familiar with the story, we'll know that Pandora, eventually her curiosity gets the better of her. She opens the box and all of these nasties come out. These are diseases, evils, all those sorts of things that fly out of the box. Now, the way I figure it is I spend a lot of my time as a classics teacher having to defend what it is that I do, something I've spent my life studying and spent my life learning how to teach and teaching in schools. I consider all of these criticisms to be these various different blights. I feel that often these have been quite ingrained in society because we've been hearing the stale old arguments over and over again, questions about relevance, questions about value to our students. And so the reason why I've chosen this as a theme for the talk is that I'm going to be addressing each of these blights that are coming out of Pandora's box, the biggest ones that I could think of, certainly not all of them, as there is just not enough time in the day to do that. A little bit of a rundown as to what I'm going to try and cover in this session. So first of all, reasons why classics should be included on school curricula, in particular secondary curricula, but of course there is scope for putting it into primary as well for the strength of its storytelling, its mythology. How? We're going to look at common worries or blights and anxieties and misconceptions, and I'm going to try and respond to each one of those in turn. I feel as if information is provided, then we go away with that information. We go away better informed, and we can begin making steps to actually change the status quo as it is now, and with a view to getting the classics firmly back on the school curricula. I think the first issue facing classics teachers and classics as an academic discipline, and therefore as a knock-on effect to schools as well, is the very, very poor negative public perception of the classics. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, it always was the mainstay of the elite back in the day. It had been used by intellectuals as a lingua franca in the Renaissance. So people like Newton, Leibniz, people from all different countries around Europe would all be writing in Latin, and also that their academic work was accessible to people of other countries who spoke different languages. So Latin was a lingua franca, and from that point onwards, very much continued on with the perception that it was meant for the elite, the more intelligent, the ruling oligarchy. And so, unfortunately, that seems to have been the case today as well. By another historical fluke, it became a prerequisite for entrance into some of the more prestigious universities in the UK. Not only that, it's also quite heavily embedded in some of the most well-known and most expensive schools in the UK, so not to mention places like Eton, Harrow, these sorts of places. Following on from that, and perhaps this is just my personal perception of why we're perceived so lowly generally by the public, is that we have people quoting it in public. These people usually are politicians. They are usually people who do not have a great deal of respect from the populace. And so when they hear a literary reference that goes back to the classics, they think, well, this is just this person being a bit of a toff, being elitist, and being academically superior to set them apart from us, the normal people of the country. So in a latest poll by YouGov, this information is accurate as of 2018, we have this. So this is all of the subjects rated in terms of how important the populace think they are. The darkest blue bar says how people think that it's very important in terms of percentages, and the other colours go down in importance. What you'll notice is that classics and Latin is at the very, very bottom here. Only 3% think that Latin is very important, 7% think classics is very important, and the largest section of green bar, not at all important, 47% of the public think that Latin is not important, and 19% of the public think that classics are not at all important. And so this very much is a public perception that we're having to fight against. It's something that I find myself quite frequently having to defend my subject against. It is something that is accessible to all. It's something that should be given to all. However, there are a number of blockages in the public school system, in the secondary academy system, that are stopping the provision of otherwise very talented classics and ancient world teachers in getting their subjects out to students. This public perception also makes it very difficult for schools who do offer classics and a classics department. As parents see on the school prospectus, they see subjects like classics, Latin, classical civilization, ancient history, ancient Greek, all offered by the school. And because there is this prevailing taste consensus of the general populace that these subjects are not useful, there is a pressure on schools to justify why they offer those subjects. Now, unless you're a specialist classics teacher and you know fully what your rationale is, that explanation usually falls by the wayside when justified by school leaders, because they don't know the ins and outs and the nuances of why classics, Latin, ancient history, ancient languages are important to modern life. And so this is another thing that comes off as an offshoot of the poor public perception of these subjects. So another problem with the classics today, and this is a subject that I feel very passionate about, something that riles me up quite a lot, is that classics throughout the ages has been overtaken by slightly dubious people in history to suit their own historical agendas. And so I believe that public perception of that often is just a very long-lasting legacy of the way the classics have been manipulated by more sinister characters in history. I'll tell you what I mean a little bit more on this slide. So, as I mentioned before, in the Renaissance, there was this renewed interest in classical literature, culture, and the idea of that is because they were looking back on Rome and Greece and the civilizations around the Mediterranean, and they viewed them as sort of the pinnacle of civilized society up until that point, something that they hadn't been able to reach since then. And so they were viewed with renewed interest. Not long after, classics emerged as an academic discipline in about the 18th century. So Hegel says that learning classics and Latin and ancient history is kind of something you should do to develop your mind and your spirit. And alongside that, Latin, as I mentioned before, was a lingua franca for academic people across Europe and indeed across the world as well. And so on one hand, that might be considered a very positive thing. On the other hand, because it's being used as a lingua franca by hugely learned and intelligent academic peoples, it already began to seem inaccessible to the common folk. So Greek and Roman culture was seen as the pinnacle of human achievement, something that hadn't been replicated before or since. In particular, the democracy of Rome of the 6th century BC was seen with quite a great deal of envy, especially in the Renaissance, when people were looking at their monarchs and their ruling systems, and they were beginning to think about other ways in which it could be done. And so a lot of these people would regard the Greeks in particular, despite being so long ago from when they were standing in time, they would have considered that much more favourable form of government. So there became this idealization of a classical past, and you can see why, but unfortunately this kicked off a bit of a chain of events. From there, the classical past had this kind of air of prestige, this aura about it. Now, unfortunately, this is the point where it gets picked up and hijacked by dubious people throughout history who use it to suit their own political agendas. So the key thing is the fascism of the mid-20th century. So fascism comes from the Latin word fasces. This is the plural of fascis, which is a type of instrument that was carried around by the emperor's bodyguards. It was a bundle of elm twigs wrapped up together with an axe on the end. What it represented was the total control of the emperor over its citizenry. It said that the emperor could demand someone to be executed on the spot, and one of the lictors, one of the bodyguards, would execute that people, and there'd be no legal problems with that whatsoever. So from this, fascism has come from this, and obviously we have the fascist movement of Mussolini, who used the ideology of the Roman Empire, some would argue not particularly well, in order to implement his own fascist government. And so this is what he ended up with. So this is a fantastic meme I found on the internet. So we've got the actual Roman Empire, and then we've got this kind of rubbish mimicry of whatever Mussolini was trying to do with the classics. So we've seen that he's manipulated the classics not particularly well, but again, that creates a legacy downtime of the classics being of a certain person or being used by a certain type of person. To a lesser extent, in terms of ideology, I suppose you could say also the fascist movement of Hitler as well. Either way, despite there are much fewer classical references in Hitler and Nazi ideology, it still has these kind of ring of the classics and Western imperialism. So this gives rise to the idea of the natural right of conquerors. So it doesn't matter, as long as you have a larger force, as long as you are civilized, then you can take over as many barbarian peoples as you like. And it doesn't matter because those people, supposedly, in air quotes, are less civilized, therefore they do not matter. And so all of these ideas mounted up to this idea of the natural right of conquerors. So in particular, this was used most notably in America. So the idea that the white European settlers came over to America, they were more quote unquote civilized, and they used that as a justification for the subjugation of native peoples and slavery. We had this strange parallel of American ideals of right to life and freedom conveniently sitting alongside slavery and subjugation. So, well, we have right to life and freedom because we're the natural conquerors. We are, quote unquote, superior to these other people. And it sat also conveniently alongside the idea of manifest destiny, which allowed for white settlers to sweep through the Americas, subjugating native peoples. And this is the sort of legacy historically that classics teachers are having to fight against in order to get classics onto the curriculum. Now, while normal people, people who are perhaps slightly less informed about classics, may not know specifically about these things, I believe that these things do have a cultural legacy from these episodes in history going forward, something that we must all fight against. So as we've seen on the previous slide, there are some slightly more worrisome and specious arguments about the classics being some sort of apparatus of white oppressors. But we know as modern observers, especially in this time of fake news, and there's no one better at this than, in many ways, the modern media, is that you can take something, information, literature, whatever it is, cultural stuff, and you can draw false parallels with it, and you can create intentional mistranslations or just wishful thinking. And so those are the sorts of arguments that I've been reading across the classics academia, critics of classics as an academic discipline, and they will say that inherently classics can be used even without any editing as some kind of manifest for the idea of white supremacy. But I feel as if there's a lack of real nuanced debate on what history is and how we use history, because classics, after all, a large chunk of it is ancient history. So let's think about a little bit more nuanced detail about what history actually is and how it's used. So with all sorts of history, you get out what you put in. If you walk in with an agenda to use it for diabolical ends, as with Mussolini in Italy in the 1930s and 40s, you're going to be able to find something that you can cynically manipulate for your own ends. You get out what you put in. Okay, so history is not static. It's never empirically knowable. It changes all the time. And the reason why it changes is because it changes depending on what questions you bring to history. Okay, so yes, we're talking about history here, but of course that still applies to the classics. So history changes depending on what questions we bring to it. So more modern parallels are that there's been an upswell in feminist history, and that's the reason for that is because there's been more questions and pressures and concerns in our society about gender equality. And so people are looking backwards onto the history with different questions regarding gender equality. And so they're coming back with information and different interpretations based on those questions. So what I'm trying to get at is this. So a lot of people are saying that classics is the apparatus of the white oppressor. You get out what you put in. The history itself always changes. It can be changed by whoever's looking at it. And so the history itself is not responsible for the way in which it's interpreted. So if it's been used by people throughout history to suit X, Y, Z political agenda, it doesn't mean that it's inherently allied with white supremacy. So this is the key driver of what I'm getting at here. With the critics of classics as a discipline will say it's mainly Eurocentric, but there are vast parts of classical history that have no white agenda whatsoever. For example, in the OCR Ancient History course, there's an entire unit on Persia, totally devoid of any kind of interaction from Europe. And so what I'm trying to get at with people in the past, they will tend to skew the historical facts to fit their agenda. So there's nothing about classics that is inherently allied to Western imperialism. Also, the fact that new perspectives breed new questions, and those new questions breed new interpretations as well. So despite the fact that classics has a bit of a rep of being only wealthy, white, learned academic men, there is actually a very, very rich tradition of working class females and people of colour being very active in the classics as well. It's not just a mainstay of white Europeans. It is something that is accessible all over the globe. It is something that other countries do buy into with quite a lot of enthusiasm, and therefore we have quite a lot of classicists. In fact, loads and loads of classicists that are not just white, learned, middle-aged men like you might consider historians to be, but they're also women of colour and men of colour, black, Asian, minority and ethnic backgrounds as well. That's my kind of main response to the historical context that classics is situated in right now. So something that everyone in classics is continuing to fight against, the idea of it being white oppressor, that it being the mainstay of the wealthy academic oligarchy, aristocracy, and so actually it's simply not true. And so another part of my response to that blight that's come out of Pandora's box is to look at some of these leading classicists in the field, and here are a few of them here. So this is Dr. Catherine Harlow. She's at the University of Reading. Got Dr. Zena Kamash at Royal Holloway, University of London. Got Dr. Sarah Derbu, Centre for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford University, again, a very prestigious school. Got Dr. Michael Kwadwo Okyere Asante at Stellenbosch University. We've got Dr. Mathura Omachamdran at Cornell. And also we've got Dr. Dan L. Padilla Peralta at Princeton University. All of these are very prestigious schools, and all of these people are leading the fight back of the public perception of classics being fusty old practice that can only be achieved through studying in dusty old libraries hidden away from the normal populace. It is accessible. It can be accessed through secondary academies. People can rise to prominence with this study of classics, Latin, ancient languages, ancient history under their belts. And these people have often come from less privileged backgrounds. And again, it just attests to the fact that we need to have these pathways available to the students in all sorts of schools, not just grammars or independent schools, but also state secondaries and local authority schools as well. Because people can make careers out of it and lead very, very fulfilled lives studying something that they would not have been exposed to before had they not been able to access a classics, ancient history or ancient languages course. So the next facet of my argument is something that I often find myself talking to people about, particularly parents and anyone who kind of wishes to know. They often come at me with a sarcastic sort of tone and go, well, what is it good for? They think they already know, and they think they're going to fight back with whatever it is that I say with some kind of comment, X, Y, Z, whatever. But actually, I think that again, we need a bit of a more nuanced argument about the relevance of classics to modern society. So the past matters to the present. Therefore, accurate knowledge of the past is and continues to be relevant. This is a quote I've taken from Neville Morley's Classics, Why It Matters. We study history due to the impact that history has on our present. And so I don't understand why we can't extend that same logic to the classics and the bulky, massive ancient history part of those classics. So the fact is, if we're looking backwards 50 to 100 years, looking backwards all the way to the Normans in the British history curriculum, but we still need to figure out how those systems came to be as well. And all of these systems, again, they come from the past as well. And we often take for granted just how much effect the ancient civilizations and power structures have on our present. In fact, some of them are so enduring that they become so ingrained in modern society that we no longer recognize it as an ancient thing. So the classics is the study of ancient history centered primarily around the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so that's generally the broad umbrella of what classics is, what it concerns itself with. So obviously the two main civilizations that we think are the most notable around the Mediterranean are Rome and Greece. However, there's a problem there. People go, oh, Rome and Greece, these are Eurocentric, these are white people. Again, there's lack of diversity there. But again, there needs to be a little bit more nuance in this argument. The fact is that in Rome and Greece, there was freedom of movement. There were no hard borders. Across borders, yes, you might have a military garrison. However, it was more of a show of power than it was a hard border stopping people from getting through. Therefore, there was freedom of movement across these empires. So there was no hard borders, a freedom of movement. So also that means that the reach of these civilizations would have far extended the normal sort of borders that we attribute to these empires. As historians, we love dividing stuff up in terms of space and time. And so what we fail to acknowledge is that there aren't any borders. And so there is a huge amount of grey space across where we've put the borders and where that influence actually reaches to. What that means is that there's a huge assimilation and amalgamation of cultures. We assume that if it's within the borders of the empire, then everyone lived as a Roman or a Greek within that empire. However, what we see is a lot more complicated than that. What we see is the mixing of different cultures. You can see it in shared gods. For instance, we've got Sulis Minerva in Bath, which was a conglomeration of the local goddess Sulis and the Roman goddess Minerva. It was an effort to merge those two peoples together and give them some sort of common ground. We see the same in Egypt. We see Serapis, who was a shared god between both Egyptians and Greeks. And so we see this all over the place. And to have it so cut and dry and black and white is a bit of an exercise in futility. Actually, it's a lot more to do with shades of grey and different spaces in between. It's not quite as black and white as everyone says that it is. Another key aspect is that yes, classics is a study of ancient history around the Mediterranean, but it is only one of the cultural traditions that informs our present. What we also see is departments at any sort of prestigious universities. You have Near Eastern studies, you have Oriental studies, you have Asian and Middle Eastern studies at universities as well. And they are very prominent and they have pride of place at those universities. And a key argument I think I have there is that why does classics not have the same pride of place along with these other area cultural studies that we have very prominently at some of the most prestigious universities? For some reason, it seems to be only the classics that is getting a great amount of shtick from critics rather than any other area cultural study. Another facet to my response to this blight of this doubt about relevance or why should it be on the curriculum, it doesn't apply to anything, goes a little bit like this. So we know, not only as historians, we like to draw neat little lines along maps and say, well, Empire X finished here and it started here. Unfortunately, we know that it's not quite that simple, and anyone who says it is so, especially in the ancient world, it is intentionally not looking at certain pieces of nuance to do with the way history actually works. So another key thing to do with that is not only do we tend to divide up history in terms of space, we also tend to divide it up in terms of time. We divide history up into discrete time periods, and it's called periodization. So as with borders, the dividing up of time into discrete periods is also an invention. It's an oversimplification as well. In the same way you can't say that the empire finished here and started here, and there's many parts of grey in between and a mixing of cultures between the two. Similarly, we can't say the same for time either. We cannot reasonably say that the X empire started at position Y and ended at position Z, and so how can we say the same for time? Therefore, it's an oversimplification to say that the time and influence of empire or civilization X started or ended at certain points. There are going to be huge overlaps, not only in terms of space, but in terms of culture and in terms of time as well. So not only culturally, but spatially and temporally as well. A lot of things that we tend to ignore in terms of the relevance of classics in the modern world is that the emperor, despite how there was no emperor in the West, there was an emperor in the East for a very long time after the fall of the Roman Empire. In fact, the last Holy Roman Emperor abdicated in 1808. Also, we're ignoring the fact that these structures that were put in place by the ancients in the classical world are enduring, and they endure as archetypes of the way we run our societies. We have themes in early Roman history, whether legendary or not, that has kings, and then basically that power passes more and more into the people. So we have themes of protest and early democracy flourishing at the beginning of, in particular, Rome's story. And whether or not those stories are an invention, those themes are very, very prominent and gives future people something to grasp onto, especially when faced with a particularly tyrannical monarch. So the social system still remained, and the idea of previous civilizations not only lingered but were prominent as social archetypes and as historical precedents for future actions. The symbolic handover of power, the ruling classes, the societal systems, often passed by unnoticed by the everyday citizens. All these machinations and the minutiae of governmental details often made very little difference to the people on the ground, the normal populace, as it were. And so, in many ways, the real history is the story of them. Could easily have the argument that despite how these civilizations lived many hundreds and thousands of years ago, their social, political, and societal systems still remained in place. Granted, these systems are in their infancy, but as Newton said, I can only see further because I stood on the shoulders of giants. The only reason why these things are able to be developed is because there is a microcosm of that idea that exists anyway. And so any new developments of those ideas are a pre-existing idea, and the current thinkers experience, those two combined create a development of that social, political, or societal system. Not only is classical thought a large chunk of our present in our pre-existing systems that are so deeply ingrained in our societal norms that we don't even notice them anymore, but also a lot of critics of classics will say that the scope is very, very narrow and it focuses only on a set amount of people in a set part of the world or a set amount of time, and it focuses mainly on the history. However, what a lot of people tend not to understand is that classics is an umbrella, and underneath that umbrella has a lot of different disciplines. So we have classics. Underneath the classics umbrella, we have literature, we have philosophy, architecture, archaeology, ethics, history, science, and language as well. Everyone talks about classics and the fact that they had to learn Latin at school and they didn't enjoy it. And what I find when I speak to a lot of these people is that their criticism of the classics is often a knee-jerk reaction from not being taught Latin, especially inspirationally when they were at school. And so another facet of my argument is this. So if classics covers all of these subjects, and it's just one subject that deserves a little bit of a place on the curriculum, and you're covering all of these different things that all add to our own experience of the world and enriches our lives, then you're getting a hell of a lot of a bang for your buck if you're a school. You pay the same amount. In many ways, you probably pay less because there are lots of societies out there that will give grants to schools who are starting a classics department. So often schools will pay less, and in return for giving it a chance, they will have all of this cultural capital that classics teachers are able to deliver to their students, which is going to be especially beneficial in schools that have not had classics provision before, in state academies in less affluent areas. And these things can really open up the experience of these students and allow them to see the world with new eyes and give a new depth and width to their experience. So to continue my argument about the relevance of classics in modern life, I'd like to pick up again on this quote from Isaac Newton. If I could see further, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. The fact that the ancient civilizations, Romans, Greeks, great thinkers of their time, came up with these concepts that seemed quite wild at the time, but created something to refer to for future generations. And so thinkers of later on would look backwards, pick up on these experiences and these ideas, add in something that to do with their own personal experience, and then they'd be able to develop that idea. Without that bedrock, that foundational idea to begin with, these ideas perhaps would have taken many hundreds of years more to develop, or perhaps may not have been created at all. And so we can't really think about anything that is created by modern man without first looking at what was first talked about by the ancients. So pretty much everything you can think of in modern society has a foundational basis in classics somewhere. So let's have a look at some of these right now. So when you talk about literature, you can't talk about literature without talking about some of the greatest pieces of literature ever created. We've got Virgil's Aeneid. We've got Ovid and his love poetry. We've got Homer and his Odyssey. So these were all held up as kind of the pinnacle of what good writing was, and are still even now used as archetypes and templates for other literature. Philosophy, again, all of our philosophy of the modern age has come about as a development of philosophy that came before. So you can't talk about philosophy without talking about Plato and his dialogues, which featured heavily Socrates. Whether or not Socrates actually said those things, or if they're an invention of Plato, at this point is actually immaterial. The fact is, those dialogues have become so influential that they've been used as a bedrock and foundational basis for any ideas going forward. You also can't talk about philosophy without Aristotle and his work on ethics. And both of these people, Plato and Aristotle, went on to influence Seneca and Cicero. Seneca is especially prominent in Stoic philosophy. So also we've got science. We've got Galen. We've got Aristotle as well, a Renaissance man, if you like, one of the greatest things ever to have lived. And you've also got Ptolemy. Galen started our first ideas about anatomy. This was all due to the fact that a lot of this medical work was done in Egypt, because in Greece and Rome at the time, it was sacrilege to desecrate a dead body. And there was that scientific freedom of the Ptolemy reigning dynasty in Egypt that allowed for the free reign of science to really accelerate the speed of ideas. So with architecture, you can't talk about architecture without Vitruvius. You can't talk about ethics without Plutarch. Plutarch wrote a certain type of history. He wrote biography, and in those biographies, he'd be talking about the vices and virtues of the people that he spoke about. He also liked to compare famous figures. Famously, he put Alexander in parallel with Julius Caesar, and in comparing those two and their actions and the way they were as people, he could tease out details about what good ethical behavior was, what those vices and virtues were. And history, we can't talk about history without the widely regarded to be the grandfather of history, Herodotus. Also, we can't talk about Livy, who wrote about the foundations of Rome, and also Thucydides. We can also talk about Sallust. We can also talk about Tacitus. Tacitus, in turn, went on to influence Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. So all of these, my point is, all of these create the foundational bedrock for any future ideas to develop. Without any of these writers, without any of the classics, our ideas would have been vastly delayed, or perhaps may not have come to fruition at all. Also, another thing that's worth noting about these writers, and another tantalizing layer of complexity here, is that yes, all of these writers on this screen right now are white and male. However, we're to understand that because, as I said earlier on in this talk, that the boundaries were not as physical, and there weren't any hard borders. There's a freedom of movement across many areas of not only Europe but also Asia as well. That these ideas, quite tantalizingly, possibly very likely, in fact, came from areas of Asia, which was, of course, a highly advanced civilization. And so these ideas would have come down, sort of the precursors to the Silk Roads, and perhaps even the Royal Road built by Persian King Darius around 600 BC, and would have come down to Europe with scholars and traveling historians and percolated through and bubbled up through European classical culture at the time. And what we end up with is the conglomeration of all of those ideas actually bubble up in the writing of each of these writers here as well. It's not to say that it is only white scholars from the classical world that contributed to our global knowledge at the time, but these ideas would have pre-existed, and these ideas would have been based on other foundational ideas which would have been built on by these writers as well. So it's not just a kind of domination of white European thought, but it would have been a percolation of all different ideas coming from all different parts of the world, in particular Southeast Asia and China and those sorts of areas. The key thrust of the talk so far is that far being the aim for European classics to dominate the ancient global narrative, it's actually just one possible worldview that sits parallel to other cultural traditions. It's very much a far cry from what the critics of classics actually say it is. And this brings me on to my next point, and especially with the events of the last year, I'm not talking about coronavirus, I'm thinking about more to do with the Black Lives Matter movement. In particular, in modern history in schools, there's been a movement to include a greater range of cultural diversity in our history. And so I'll get on to what my point is in a moment. So another part of my response to the key blights that are affecting classics provision and its public perception in Britain and indeed the world today is greater cultural representation. And a few examples of this is in schools. I've planned on these myself. There's a renewed focus on pre-colonial West Africa. So that means kings like Benin, Mali, Asante and Songhai. And a lot of this work has been done by this gentleman, Toby Green. There's also been Black Tudors. Miranda Kaufman wrote this fantastic book on Black Tudors, again giving us a more of a tantalising glimpse into the Tudor Britain and the fact there is a hell of a lot more cultural diversity in Britain at the time of the Tudors than the previous narrative indicated. Finally, there's also a renewed interest on cultural diversity in early British history as well. So that means Beachy Head Lady, a sub-Saharan African woman who found on Beachy Head, and similar for the Ivory Bangle Lady as well. And so with these greater ideas about greater cultural representation in terms of the classics, in terms of ancient history, a lot of students won't hear anything about their own European narrative at all, aside from perhaps one unit of history in year 7, where we'll look at the Romans. Strangely, a lot of the time it jumps from Romans on to Anglo-Saxons, which leaves a temporal gap of several hundred years. I'm a big fan personally of the idea of history being all about doors and mirrors. So doorways into other times, other cultures, other spaces. So we're giving the chance to look through those doors into other areas and other experiences. But are we using a mirror? Are we holding up a mirror to these students and showing them their own cultural representation, where the bedrock of European civilization has come from, and how that European civilization has sat alongside other civilizations and other cultural traditions as well? So in terms of the greater cultural representation, I believe that classics plays a very, very important part in fitting into that wider national jigsaw of providing greater cultural representation in history and in schools. Continuing my rebuttal of the third blight out of Pandora's box is the doubts about the relevance of the classics. Remembering the classics is an umbrella term for a whole bunch of different academic disciplines, namely of which would be a couple of ancient European languages such as Latin and ancient Greek, two of which these I was lucky enough to be able to study at school outside of the curriculum, and a lot of it was self-taught. Basically what I found is that my vocabulary became more expansive, the ability to express myself became more articulate and more flowing, more fluent and more fluid, and as a result, I think that the key benefit of giving this to, in particular, secondary academy students is that they then have a mouthpiece. They have the ability to express themselves with more surety and more confidence, which would be a fantastic tool for social mobility. So let's talk about the benefits about communication as well. So the percentage of English words that have Latin roots is about 60%. So over half, a large bulk of them. So it's really, really important. And in fact, it'd be very beneficial to have a look at some of this etymology from Latin in a designated course in schools. So this percentage rises to 90% in STEM fields. There's been a huge push for people to go into STEM. In particular, I remember a few years ago, there's some controversy about the lack of women in STEM fields. And so there's still this big push, this big drive into STEM fields. However, that push into STEM can become very inaccessible, especially when a lot of the vocabulary to do with science it falls by the wayside because you have no sort of grasp of where those words come from, and therefore less likely to stick in one's brain. So 10% of our Latin vocab has found its way to English without an intermediary. So it's a huge, huge impact of Latin on English. So Greek words, so Latin and Greek words are in English. So Greek words enter our vocabulary through three main channels: indirectly from the languages themselves through Latin, so they filter through other languages. They borrow directly from Greek writers, or they've been formed a little bit more recently by combining already existent Greek roots. Okay, I'll show you what I mean in a little bit. So Booker T. Washington had this fantastic quote. He said, "We don't just borrow words. On occasion, English has pursued other languages down alleyways to beat them unconscious and rifle through their pockets for new vocabulary." I love this analogy. I thought I'd just put it up there because it gives me a bit of a giggle. I think it's very pertinent. So in terms of what I was talking about in the combining of already existent Greek roots and in terms of STEM language and vocabulary, and this doesn't just apply to science, it can apply across the board as well. So let's think about the word exothermic. Okay, this is quite a common word in GCSE science. So it's in two parts, exo and thermic. So exo comes from the Greek ex, meaning out of. And this other part, therm, means heat. And so as a result of knowing those two particles, I know that any reaction that is exothermic is a reaction that is going to give out heat. And so knowing that those two different parts exist and how they interact with each other allows me to create another memory trace in my brain, because I've got something more concrete to latch that meaning onto, which therefore means that my vocabulary, if I'm able to do this, is going to become more beneficial for me to be able to do this with existing words in order so that I can remember them and express myself with more surety in the future. Also, another key thing is a couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to look in on a Lexia session. And for those of you who don't know, it's often a piece of software used to help dyslexic students get a better grasp of their literacy. And what I found just by looking at what they're doing on these laptops is it's pretty much an indication of what we've done in the middle on the right of the screen here, breaking down words into their principal etymological parts and being able to tell what each word means by breaking them down into those pieces. If it's a piece of software, so another key aspect of why I believe that classics is relevant to modern life is that it allows us to create these connections. So we're responding still to this blight of the idea that classics is not relevant to the way we run our society now. And we discussed in part how some of these ancient societal structures still exist in one society. They exist as archetypes, they exist as a historical precedent that we can always refer back to. And so I think that the classics allow us this joined up thinking from ancient to modern history. We can see these patterns of power structures, of governmental systems, and we can see this network of causes and effects. And what this allows us to do is create more complex webs of thoughts and links in our own minds. Also, the idea that these skills are transferable, whether you study ancient history, ancient languages, architecture, or whatever. Even in studying Latin language, your literacy is bound to improve. It can help you decode difficult vocabulary in any other subject that you go into, as long as you're equipped with the correct skills. It also enriches your own internal world with this idea of joined up thinking, a network of causes and effects. It opens up your experience, allows you to know more about the world in which you inhabit, and therefore have a deeper appreciation for the kind of human effort that has gone into getting society as to where it is now. It unlocks more sophisticated avenues of thought. This goes in with the joined up thinking and networks of causes and effect, especially those people who are keen on history. We're able to see long avenues of thought that link up ideas of governmental systems, what power structures are, what role people and kings and monarchs and politicians play in the grand global narrative. Classics then becomes a study of sort of psychology, a kind of Homo sapiens specific anthropological psychology, tracing the development of modern man, Homo sapiens, over millennia. If we don't study the classics, it's almost like we're studying the development of man with a missing link of 2,000 years. To me as a classicist, and perhaps I'm biased on this, it just doesn't make sense to me in when we're thinking about the grand global narrative and the development of the psychology and the ways of man. Also, it gives us the sense of changes over time. And there's one thing that's constant in this world, is the idea of change and flux. And if we can see this going throughout, the key benefit of the classics as well is the breed of classicists themselves. I find classicists among some of the most interesting people to talk to. The fact is that this practice that has been disparaged and vilified by modern society for so many years is still alive as a testament to the classicists that work within that field. We spoke about some classicists earlier on in this talk, very intelligent classicists, women of working class backgrounds, people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds as well. Far cry from the white, fusty old man that we consider historians and classicists to be. Furthermore, as a breed, classicists are pretty inspirational. I was looking for some inspiration for this talk, and I put out this tweet, and I got the inspiration back tenfold. It was retweeted nearly 100 times, the greatest uptake of anything I've ever done on Twitter. And so what I found was that there was just so much positivity about not only classics, but classicists as well, that I found really, really inspiring. Some of the most inspiring teachers I've had are teachers who taught me classics. And whether or not you think it's I enjoyed the teacher's company because I like their subject, or I like the subject because I enjoyed the teacher, it kind of matters not, because those classics teachers, my Latin teachers, my next point for the inclusion of the classics on school curricula is in a similarly personal vein to my previous point about classics leading the charge to fight back against this idea of classics being the mainstay of white fusty old men. And so this next point is all about classics as a practice, a set of disciplines in and of itself, talking specifically in particular about literature. So the literature that we find, and actually a lot of the voices that we hear speaking to us across history from the ancients, is deeply personal. If you look and listen a little bit more intently, you'll hear these voices speaking to you. They are still unavoidably human, and this comes through in their literature, which is, of course, its purpose. And so these voices are speaking to us across millennia. We can hear them, we can listen to them, but they are still unavoidably human. If you're looking for a book all about fantastical adventures, one man's journey his way home, an intensely flawed individual, which makes him more well-rounded as a character, look no further than Homer's Odyssey. If in a fit of teen angst you're having difficulty with unrequited love, as many people do, in my personal experience I turn to Ovid in his Amores, in particular of Amores 1.6, The Locked Out Lover, and that gave me a sense of catharsis and gave me comfort and gave me strength. If you're having a difficult time, look no further than the Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, who went on to influence the work of Seneca. And I still think Stoic philosophy is probably the inspiration for this. Keep calm and carry on. A whole branch of philosophy. However, even if you're convinced by all of these points, you think, right, well, let's get classics on the curriculum tomorrow when we go back to school, whenever that might be. There are still a few more blights plaguing classics as a set of disciplines in secondary schools, and these ones are mainly administrative. So first of all, a key thing about classics in schools is that it's considered a bolt-on. Okay, it's considered a bolt-on. All the while, school leaders don't understand that you might be able to teach another subject outside of curriculum, but due to the sheer expanse that the umbrella of classics covered, the fact that ancient history needs at least as much curricular space as history, and that Latin needs at least as much curricular space as an MFL, if not more, because it doesn't just do language, it does civilization, it also does literature as well. And so there are three main parts of the Latin GCSE. And so it actually requires a hell of a lot more curricular space than school leaders will give it. So because it's considered a bolt-on, it's given less curricular space. So it's also given that curricular space outside of the curriculum as well, which makes it a very difficult set of circumstances in which to succeed. So there's a lack of stability. There is often a lack of transparency as to whether or not the school will continue with the classics going on into the next year, which means that Year 10 students are left in the lurch for the next year, and there's lack of stability there. Teachers thinking about if they'll still have a job the next year, and these are creates a set of difficult circumstances in which it is very difficult to be successful. So as a result of that, you might perhaps not get the best grades for that classical discipline, but due to the stability that the school system has caused. As a result of that lack of good results, because it's been put outside the curriculum and teachers have been given a lack of stability, that means that schools, especially schools that find themselves in multi-academy trusts, they have to justify their curricular choices with the set of results that go with it. And if that set of results is not the standard that they would like, then they cannot justify the continuation of that subject. And that might not necessarily be the fault of school leaders or governors. It's just something that is worth noting, that it needs to be given the appropriate curricular space. It needs to be given a chance. It needs to be given more than a year. It needs to be given maybe 2, perhaps 3 years to run in order to get a bigger data set. In the first year, that data set, it might be quite lacking because it's a new course. That teacher has to work on, usually there's only one teacher as well, and they have to work on resourcing a whole course by themselves. The second and third years will really give an indication as to whether or not that subject can yield good results, and given enough chance, it can, because the engagement is there, the students want it, and the students want to learn it. Another key thing that is worth considering for implementation in schools is that I believe there needs to be a little bit of coverage of ancient history at the very least in Key Stage 3. If you can start Latin in Key Stage 3 as well, you might find that it has an improvement on literacy. Secondly, if you have maybe 1 unit per year in Key Stage 3 history for ancient history, you'll find that when it comes to making choices for GCSE, okay, so let's wrap up. Let's bring my rather laboured extended metaphor of Pandora's box to a close now. Now, those of you familiar with the story will know that, yes, Pandora did open her box and released all of these blights into the world. Diseases and evils and poor moral behaviour, all of these things that I've termed as the things blighting the delivery of classics in secondary schools. However, those of you familiar with the story will also know that once all of these things are released, she opens her box again, and in the corner of her box, she finds a tiny glimmering speck of hope. So what is our tiny glimmering speck of hope to end off with this talk? I believe it rests in the ability of every individual classics teacher and secondary teacher and teacher of anything to give a bit more credence to the classics. We know that it can be beneficial. We know that our societal systems, our cultural systems are so deeply ingrained from the world of the ancients that they're barely even visible to us today. The fact is, we can create connections from ancient to modern worlds. We can create these linked up avenues of thought throughout history. We can improve our experience of life by opening these avenues of thought and making our experiences wider and deeper, bringing richness to our lives. We have a speck of hope in that we have classicists themselves who are working tirelessly to bring a bit more credibility to the practice that it so sorely deserves and needs. And we have secondary school classics and Latin teachers and classicists and ancient history teachers that are desperately trying to bring all of these subjects to the secondary school curriculum because they believe that their children deserve them and that they can enrich their lives. If none of this has convinced you, and you still believe that Latin, classics and ancient history are still the mainstay of the wealthy white aristocracy, then also not forget the emotional intelligence and emotional literacy and the strength and comfort we can draw from the wells of classical literature. Ideas about Thank you for listening to my talk, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully there is something in this talk that you found convincing, and all these plights facing the classics provision up and down the land in secondary education, whether it be the historical context or public perception or doubts about the relevance of the classics. Hopefully there is something that has been covered in today's talk that has perhaps shaped your view somewhat of our sort of fields and group of disciplines. I've been Ben Windsor. I'm Head of Classics and Ancient Languages at my current school. I'm also a teacher of humanities, so history, geography, PSHE.